I stared at the landscape outside the car window. The coastline flickered between the trees, reappearing as a thin line of sand and water on the horizon. Returning to my father's house always stirred a strange mix of memories and something unnameable that pulled at my chest. This place had once been my refuge. But everything had changed since my father married Alice. The car stopped in front of the house, and the sun bathed the walls in a golden glow. Alice was standing on the porch, smiling as if she had been waiting just for me. The breeze played with her blonde hair, and her dress hugged her slim figure. "Evan!" she called out joyfully, stepping forward with her arms open for a hug. I had no choice but to step forward and hug her back, though the greeting felt a little too warm. "You haven't changed, but somehow you've grown," she said, narrowing her eyes as if trying to figure me out. "A real man." I smiled awkwardly, a subtle tension creeping up inside me. She immediately started asking about my studies and my girlfriend. Her questions sounded casual, but I could hear something in her tone, more than simple curiosity. My father appeared on the porch, pulling me into a bear hug before suggesting a walk along the shore, just like old times. I agreed, even though I was tired from the trip. The three of us set off down the path leading to the sea. Alice walked beside me. When her shoulder brushed against mine, I held my breath for a moment. She laughed at one of my dad's jokes, but the laughter seemed meant to cover something up. I tried to ignore her glances, but they were too direct, lingering just a little too long. My father talked about his plans for our vacation, and I tried to focus on his words, but my mind kept drifting back to Alice. By the time we returned, the sky had darkened. Alice was the first to head inside, but I lingered by the water for a few minutes, letting the cool sea breeze clear my head. Something about this house already felt different, like it wasn't the home I remembered. Lying in bed, I felt restless. Her smile and the way she looked at me played over in my mind, even when I closed my eyes. I tried to convince myself it was all in my imagination. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard the soft creak of the door and my father's quiet footsteps. He stood at the doorway and spoke in a low voice. "On a night like this, you can't stay inside." His words were so calm and simple that I couldn't refuse. A few minutes later, I was standing on the cool sand, staring at the moonlit waves shimmering with silver light. The air smelled of salt and seaweed. The silence of the night was broken only by the whisper of the tide. Alice stood a few steps ahead. The moonlight skimmed across her bare shoulders, making them almost glow. She turned slowly, and I caught the glint in her eyes as if she expected something more from this night. My father stepped into the water and swam toward the deeper part as if he were 20 years old again. Alice wasn't far behind, slipping forward smoothly and leaving only a faint ripple behind her. I lingered for a second, feeling the cold water wrap around my skin. Alice stayed close, as if unintentionally, but at some point her hand brushed my shoulder. I flinched slightly, but she only smiled, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The water lazily swirled between us, yet the closeness felt undeniable, almost electric. Alice lifted her head and locked her eyes with mine. Her gaze was steady, magnetic in its quiet intensity. Slowly, she moved closer until I could feel her breath on my face. Her hand brushed lightly against my neck as if testing some invisible line. For a moment, her hair swept near my face, and I realized she was leaning in for a kiss. Time seemed to freeze. My heartbeat pounded like a drum in my ears. I pulled away suddenly, breaking that fragile bridge between us. Alice hesitated for a heartbeat as though listening to her own thoughts, then let out a playful scoff and, with one swift motion, swam toward my father. She left me standing alone in the cold water, my cheeks burning and my heart ready to burst from my chest. I watched her reach him and say something carefree. My father laughed, and I was left standing in silence, as if the night itself knew everything I couldn't admit to myself. I exhaled and began swimming after them, trying to shake the memory of how close she'd been. This night felt endless, but I knew her soft laughter and the spark in her eyes would linger longer than the silver glow of the moonlight on the water. Morning came too quickly. I lay there listening to the sounds of the house. Everything was familiar. The creak of the floorboards, the whisper of the wind outside, the distant hum of the waves. but inside I felt a strange unease. Memories of last night wouldn't leave me. The moonlit water, her gaze, the way she leaned toward me. All of it returned the moment I closed my eyes. I walked down to the kitchen and was greeted by the scent of freshly brewed coffee. Alice was standing by the stove, dressed simply in a loose t-shirt and shorts. Her movements were casual, yet deliberate in a way I couldn't quite define. She turned and smiled. "Breakfast is ready." Her voice was calm, as if nothing had happened. She placed a plate of toast and sliced fruit on the table. I sat down and picked up the coffee, focusing on the warmth of the cup to ground myself, but her presence pulled at my thoughts. She looked at me a second too long, as if waiting for something. "You've changed," she said quietly, almost like an idle observation. I took a sip and stayed silent, but the tension in the room thickened. She sat across from me, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and began to arrange pieces of orange on her plate, her eyes downcast. Yet I knew she was thinking about me. Everything looked so ordinary, but underneath that surface, something more was hiding. Later that evening, my father prepared to head into town for groceries. He strode into the kitchen, fastening his jacket with a bright, distracted smile. "I'll be back soon," he said, already halfway out the door. "Don't get too bored." I nodded but didn't speak. The door shut with a thud, and the house fell into a strange, heavy silence. I heard the engine start and fade away as he drove off. Alice appeared in the doorway as if she knew this moment was hers. She held a glass of water, her gaze calm but filled with something unspoken. We were alone. I ran my hand along the countertop, seeking something solid in the simplicity of the gesture. The air felt thick, like every second was stretched thin. She took a few steps into the room while I sat still, my eyes focused downward. Everything seemed ordinary, yet I felt that something had shifted again. The morning was quiet, but inside, everything was in turmoil. I lay in bed for what felt like an eternity, staring at the ceiling and replaying her face, so close to mine last night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her gaze and felt her hand on my shoulder. I tried convincing myself that it had all been a coincidence, but the feeling wouldn't let go. I went down to the kitchen, hoping to clear my head. The scent of fresh coffee filled the house, bringing a strange sense of calm. Alice stood by the stove, stirring something in the pan. She was wearing a short tank top that revealed her waist and shorts so small they could have passed for underwear. I froze for a second, my eyes lingering on her legs and the curve of her back before I could stop myself. She must have felt it. She turned slightly, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips, one that made my shoulders tense. "You're up early," she said, her tone calm as if nothing had happened. Then she turned back to the stove, flipping the eggs with ease. I turned away and stared into my coffee cup, pretending to be distracted. But my eyes couldn't help but catch her reflection in the window. She moved through the kitchen with an almost deliberate grace, and her presence filled the room like a tangible weight. My father didn't seem to notice any of it. When he walked in a few minutes later, he kissed Alice on the cheek and gave me a warm smile, as if the scene before him was as ordinary as any other. "I'm heading into town to grab some groceries," he said, fastening his jacket. "Keep things in order while I'm gone?" I nodded, though his words barely registered. My focus was stuck on her reflection and the fact that she held my gaze a second too long again. The door shut behind him and the silence was palpable. The sound of the engine starting and fading away made the house feel emptier. Alice leaned against the counter, taking a lazy sip of water, watching me with quiet amusement. Her faint smirk gave her away. She knew exactly what she was doing. I lifted my gaze and met her eyes. The air felt stifling despite the open window. I ran my hand along the edge of the table as if that simple touch could ground me, but her gaze was impossible to ignore. She took a step toward me, slow and unhurried, but there was something bold in the way she moved. Everything looked ordinary. The quiet kitchen, the smell of coffee and sea air. But beneath that calm exterior was something else, something I didn't want to name. After dinner, Alice silently grabbed a light cardigan and gestured for me to follow. I trailed behind her without question, sensing that refusing wasn't an option. The evening air was cool and carried the scent of the sea. The path to the old pier twisted between bushes and sloped down toward the shore. Alice walked ahead, her dress brushing against her legs. The breeze caught the fabric, revealing her knees and the subtle curve of her back. I followed, noticing how each step seemed deliberate yet effortlessly graceful. The pier greeted us with the soft creak of wooden planks beneath our feet. Alice stopped at the edge and leaned against the railing. Her hair was tousled by the wind and loose strands brushed her face. She stood in silence, staring at the horizon where the sun's last light was fading over the water. I stood beside her, feeling the quiet tension between us. We both looked out at the sea, but my thoughts were only of her. Every detail, the way she adjusted her hair, the slight sway of her shoulders, felt intentional yet natural. Suddenly, she stepped closer. Her hand brushed against mine. For a moment, everything stilled, just the sound of waves and our breathing. I felt the warmth of her skin and held my breath. There was something terrifyingly intimate in that brief touch. She froze as if waiting for my reaction, but a second later she stepped back with a faint smirk. I didn't even have time to process what had happened. Time resumed its normal rhythm: wind, salty air, the sound of the waves. Alice turned and walked slowly back down the pier without looking back. I stayed where I was, watching her silhouette fade into the distance. The evening seemed ordinary, but something inside me had shifted. A simple walk had left an aftertaste I couldn't explain. The house felt hollow after my father left, filled with an unfamiliar stillness. I was ready to spend the evening quietly when Alice appeared at the door with car keys in her hand. She nodded toward the exit, and I didn't need words to understand what she had in mind. Half an hour later, we entered the beachside club. Light tore through the darkness in bursts, and the music filled the air with vibrations that settled under my skin. The crowd swayed in rhythm, bodies merging in the shadows and flashes of color. Alice shrugged off her cardigan and vanished into the crowd. Her dress clung to her frame, baring her shoulders. I lost sight of her for a moment, but then I saw her, standing on the dance floor, her gaze locked on me. The strobe lights painted her face, her smile daring me to come closer. I stepped forward, not knowing why. Her movements were fluid, but every tilt of her head, every shift of her body spoke of intent. She danced like she knew exactly what she was doing to me. When there was only a step between us, she leaned in. I felt her warmth and the faint brush of her hand against mine. Her hair grazed my face, her breath trailing along my neck. I didn't have time to pull away before her lips touched my cheek. Light, fleeting. But in the next heartbeat, her mouth slid closer to mine and the distance between us vanished. It was wrong. The noise, the crowd, the lights, all of it disappeared in that moment. There was only her and the softness of her lips, insistent yet gentle. I froze, unable to breathe. Heat spread through my body, tangled with the realization that I was standing at the edge of something forbidden. With a desperate effort, I pulled away. The cold space between us returned, but her eyes still burned with defiance. She didn't hide her smile. Whether it was triumphant or disappointed, I couldn't tell. She spun back into the crowd and began to dance again, leaving me standing in the pulse of the music and the flicker of the lights. The world resumed its rhythm, but I remained still, her taste still lingering on my lips. This isn't right. I have a girlfriend. The words sounded hollow, as though someone else had said them. Alice tilted her head and smiled faintly, as if I'd said something innocent and sweet. The strobe lights flashed, highlighting the gleam in her eyes, part daring, part something softer, more dangerous. "Relax, it's just a coincidence," she whispered and winked. Her voice dissolved into the air along with her smile, but it felt like she'd left a mark behind. I stood frozen, the spot where her lips had touched my cheek still burning as she disappeared back into the crowd. Her silhouette swayed with the music, free and fluid, as if she knew I was still watching her. I took a deep breath, trying to regain control over my thoughts, but her presence clung to me like a shadow. Everything around me, the music, the voices, the laughter, blurred into a dull hum. When we got home, the house greeted us with the soft glow of the lamps and the comforting scent of tea. The familiar space should have anchored me, but the memory of what happened stayed sharp in my mind. It was just a joke, I repeated to myself like a mantra, as if I could drown out her voice. I brewed some tea and sat down at the table, feeling like I was balancing on the edge of a cliff. The front door thudded, followed by my father's quick steps. He entered with a bag of groceries and a wide grin, as if his day had been filled with good news. "Evan, we're having a real dinner tonight. I got fresh salmon. Let's cook it." His cheerful tone felt almost foreign. Everything about this scene was too normal, yet surreal at the same time. Alice appeared in the kitchen a few minutes later. She'd changed into a simple house dress that somehow made her movements look even more graceful. Her face was calm, almost glowing with composure. She stepped to the counter and began slicing vegetables with precise, practiced motions. She and my father chatted about groceries and breakfast plans. Their conversation faded into background noise. I tried to focus on their voices to drown out my thoughts, but even the smallest movements Alice made caught my attention. She laughed at one of my father's jokes, the sound light and warm. But as she placed a plate on the table, she paused for a heartbeat and glanced at me over her shoulder. It lasted only a second, but it felt like a punch to my chest. I watched as she seamlessly returned to the conversation as if nothing had happened. But everything inside me screamed that this wasn't a joke, and it wasn't an accident. I stayed silent throughout dinner. Everything around me was perfect, so perfect that it felt like a mask hiding something deeper. The control I thought I had was slipping away, but I didn't say a word. I shut the door to my room and sank onto the bed, clutching my phone in my hands. My fingers trembled slightly, though I couldn't say why. I stared at the screen for a long time before finally dialing Jessica's number. The phone rang, and a few seconds later, her voice filled the quiet room. "Evan! Finally!" Her voice was warm and soothing, wrapping around me like a blanket. "Hey, Jess. I miss you," I whispered, closing my eyes. I expected her to say, "I miss you too," but instead she launched into everything happening back home. Her new job, plans for a trip, how she envisioned our life once we finally moved into our own place. I listened, but her words sounded distant, muffled, as though there was an invisible wall between us. I wanted to tell her the truth, to confess that something was changing here, in this house, inside me. But I couldn't. Her plans were clear and full of certainty, while I felt like a stranger in those dreams. "Evan, you still want to move, right?" she asked suddenly, snapping me back to reality. "Of course," I lied, keeping my voice steady. After the call ended, I sat there with the phone resting on my lap. It felt like I had betrayed her simply by not saying anything about what had happened. Her voice echoed in my mind, repeating the same question over and over. "Are you still the one I love?" A knock on the door made me look up. It was my father. "I'm pulling some old things down from the attic. Will you help me?" he asked, his easy smile making everything seem simpler. I nodded, stuffed the phone into my pocket, and followed him. The attic stairs creaked beneath our feet, and the dusty scent of old wood and forgotten boxes filled the air. My father rolled up his sleeves and began lifting heavy boxes with surprising energy. "This is our family's whole history in one place," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. I noticed Alice climbing up after us. She looked calm and carefree, her hair tied up in a loose bun, her expression serene, as if this day was no different from any other. She smiled at my father, grabbed a broom, and started sweeping the floor. Everything about her seemed so normal, so perfectly ordinary, that my chest tightened. I kept my eyes on the boxes, refusing to look at her. But every time she walked past me, every time our eyes met for a fleeting second, the air seemed to thicken. The way she touched the old furniture, the soft laugh she let out at some random discovery, it all felt like a play where I was the only one aware of the tension. My father didn't notice a thing. His voice filled the attic as he told stories about each item we found. But I barely heard him. All I could hear was the hum of my own thoughts and the unspoken weight of her presence, calm and unbothered, as if nothing had ever happened. And somehow, that made it worse. After lunch, the house was filled with a lazy silence. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm reflections on the walls. I thought about retreating to my room to escape my thoughts, but Alice appeared in the kitchen doorway with a soft smile and suggested, "Let's take a walk along the shore." Her tone was casual, but I immediately knew the idea wasn't random. My father, lounging on the couch with a newspaper, perked up. "Great idea, let's bring some wine." He stood up, slapping his knees, and went to grab a bottle. A few minutes later, we were making our way down the path to the beach. The sand was warm underfoot, and the salty sea breeze carried the scent of seaweed. John walked ahead with the bottle and glasses, a content smile on his face, while Alice walked slightly behind him, calm and reflective. Near the water's edge, my father sat on a large rock and opened the wine. Alice sat beside him, and I stayed standing, gazing at the horizon where the sky shifted into hues of gold as the sun began to set. "Do you remember our first date?" Alice asked with a light smile, looking at John. He chuckled briefly. "Of course. I got the cafe wrong and ended up on the other side of the city." Alice smiled, but something flickered in her eyes, something fleeting and sad that she quickly masked with her laughter. I watched them, feeling a strange discomfort. Their memories should have sounded warm, but instead they felt like an intrusion, as if I had stumbled upon something I was never meant to hear. "You're the best gift of my life," John said, raising his glass toward her. He said it so simply, so routinely, as if it were a phrase he'd repeated for years. Alice nodded, but her smile seemed strained. I looked away, trying not to notice the awkwardness, but I caught the moment her eyes dimmed slightly. She stared out at the horizon, and in that gaze was something deeper than fatigue. It was the look of someone who'd been waiting for something that never arrived. We stood in silence, watching the sunset, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts. It was supposed to be a simple walk, but I could feel that beneath the quiet waves and the glint of the sun on the water, there was something far more complex. The night was warm, but the shadows of the trees outside swayed as if restless themselves. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, my thoughts circled around the same things: her gaze, her voice, her touch. Everything resurfaced, no matter how hard I tried to focus on Jessica. I remembered Jessica's bright laugh, her stories about our future plans. Those things should have grounded me in reality. But the more I tried to focus on her, the more memories of Alice invaded my mind, like an unstoppable current. My phone lay on the bedside table, the screen glowing faintly with a notification. I reached for it and, without thinking, opened the gallery. My eyes drifted across old photos until my fingers paused on her face. Pictures of Alice. They were there in greater numbers than I'd realized. Candid shots, her brushing back her hair in the sunlight, laughing at one of my father's jokes, staring thoughtfully into the distance. I didn't even remember saving them. The hum in my head grew louder. A slow, aching feeling spread in my chest, a mix of anxiety and longing. I placed the phone back on the table and closed my eyes, but the images wouldn't leave. The tension inside me built, and every breath felt heavier. Alone in the room, I let myself sink into my thoughts. I imagined her scent, fresh, with a hint of something spicy. I pictured her hair falling over her shoulders, her soft smile, her whispered words. The room felt detached from reality. It was just me and her. No words, no boundaries. But suddenly the door creaked open and my eyes flew open. Alice stood in the doorway, no knock, no warning. Her hair was slightly tousled, as if she'd just gotten out of bed. That familiar smirk played on her lips, the one that always left me off balance. Her eyes scanned the room, then settled on me for a moment longer than they should have before locking onto mine. I froze, caught like a thief in the act. The air grew thick and heavy. "Oh, sorry," she said softly, but there was a trace of amusement in her tone, as if she knew more than she should. Her lips curved slightly, and I knew she saw everything, knew exactly what she'd walked in on. I sat on the bed, feeling the tension spread through every inch of my body. My mind was a storm, a whirlwind of fear, shame, and something stronger, something I was afraid to name. The door creaked open again, and Alice stepped in, closing it behind her so quietly that the click of the lock felt deafening. She didn't say a word, but her eyes spoke louder than any words could. She moved closer, slow and deliberate, as if giving me time to stop her. But I did nothing. "Dad won't be back for a while," she whispered, her voice warm, almost like a caress. Her gaze held me in place, as though the space between us no longer existed. She placed one knee on the bed and leaned in. Her hand pressed gently but firmly against my shoulder, guiding me to lie back. My heart pounded in my chest like an alarm, warning me that we'd crossed the line. "You're my stepmother," I muttered hoarsely, as if those words could stop either of us. She smiled, not mockingly, but with a challenge that only fueled the fire inside me. "So what?" she whispered, her hand brushing over my chest, leaving a trail of heat in its wake. My hands rose instinctively to stop her, but instead, they rested on her shoulders. That touch became the point of no return. Her breath, the scent of her skin, the way her hair brushed against my face, it all blurred into one overwhelming wave. In that moment, nothing else existed. She leaned down, and her lips pressed against mine with a need that felt raw and unrestrained. This wasn't just a kiss. It was something deeper, something that stripped away every thought and left only sensation. Her warmth, her movements, the thrum of my heartbeat in my ears. It all blended together. Then, the sharp sound of footsteps outside the door shattered the moment like a bolt of lightning. The door flew open, and my father stood there, keys in hand. His eyes locked onto us, and the world collapsed around me. Alice pulled away so quickly it was as though she'd been struck. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair disheveled. I scrambled off the bed, searching for words that wouldn't come. My father stared at us in silence. His face was calm, but his eyes were filled with a storm of rage and pain. "What was that?" he asked quietly, and that quiet was more terrifying than any shout. Alice straightened, brushed her hair back, and took a step to the side. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice steady, but her hands trembled. I still said nothing. Words felt useless. Everything was already written on the walls of that room. My father's hand opened and the keys fell to the floor with a loud clatter. "Out," he said, barely audible. I wanted to speak, but my tongue felt glued to the roof of my mouth. He took a step forward and I saw something I'd never seen before. A man standing at the edge between heartbreak and fury. Alice moved first. She walked out without saying another word, and the sound of her footsteps down the stairs broke the silence. I stayed frozen in place, feeling the room close in around me. My father stood there, his fists clenched tight. "Go," he repeated. I nodded slowly and walked toward the door, not even knowing where I was going. All I could hear was his breathing and the deafening echo of my own thoughts. As I stepped outside, the first shout came. My father's voice was filled with a fury that had been held back for too long. "How could you?" His words rang out so loud I froze for a second on the porch. "You don't understand." Alice's voice wavered as she tried to respond. I could still hear them as I walked down the path, but I didn't look back. I knew that if I turned around even once, I'd never be able to forgive myself, or him. By the time I reached the bus stop, the night had settled over the street like a cold, silent blanket. The street lamp cast a dim glow, and there was no one else around. I sat on the bench and buried my face in my hands. The sound of blood rushing through my ears wouldn't stop. I waited for the bus, feeling hollow. After a few minutes, the headlights pierced the darkness, and the old night bus pulled up with a faint screech. I climbed the steps and found a seat by the window. The glass was cold as I pressed my forehead against it, closing my eyes. The road stretched out into the darkness, but my thoughts kept dragging me back, to the shouting, the glances, and that single moment when everything collapsed. I couldn't say I didn't understand why it happened. What hurt more was knowing it had been inevitable. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Slowly, I pulled it out and saw a message from Jessica. "You've been quiet. Is everything okay? I'm worried about you." Her words were simple, but they made me feel worse. I stared at the screen, unsure of what to say. She was my anchor, the one thing tying me to the life I'd tried so hard to protect. But I had ruined everything, even though part of me still hoped I could fix it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed a few words but deleted them, typed again, and erased it once more. Nothing felt right. I opened the gallery, almost as if compelled. Her photos appeared. Alice, her eyes shining with laughter, her hair caught in the sunlight. There were so many. I hadn't realized how often I'd captured her. The images spoke louder than anything else. I wanted to remember her, and that desire was tearing me apart. I ran my finger across the screen, but I couldn't bring myself to delete the photos. Instead, I closed the gallery and let the phone drop onto my lap. At the next stop, the bus doors hissed open, and a cold breeze swept inside. I stared out at the dark highway and realized I wasn't heading anywhere specific. I was just running away. The streetlights blurred past and disappeared into the night. I tried to gather my thoughts, to make sense of what had happened. My father's face appeared in my mind, his eyes filled with rage and disappointment. His words echoed again, sharp as a blade. "You could have said no. This wouldn't have happened without mutual consent." I'd tried to explain, to tell him that she'd made the first move, but he hadn't listened. "You're my son. You were my son," he'd said, staring straight into my eyes. "But now you're nothing to me." Those words cut deeper than any punishment. I felt something inside me crack as if the bridge between us had been burned to ashes. The bus rolled forward slowly, but I stayed trapped in that house, hearing his footsteps, his voice. This trip had destroyed everything I thought I knew about myself, about life, about family. Something had ended for good, and I knew I might never find my way back. The letter came unexpectedly. I found it in the morning among the usual ads and bills, tossing the envelope onto the table without immediately realizing who it was from. The return address was blank, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My heart clenched. I stared at the white envelope for a long time before finally tearing it open. The scent of the paper mixed with something warm and bitter. Memories. "Evan, I know this letter won't explain everything or ease the pain we caused each other, but I needed to write this, to leave something behind other than a shadow on your life. I always knew this was wrong, but you made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, when I thought I was just a shadow of someone else's expectations. I'm not making excuses. This is my weakness. I was looking for attention I wasn't getting, warmth I couldn't find next to John. And you were there, too close. It ruined everything. I understand that. And I'm sorry. Please don't try to understand me or forgive me. Just live the way you want. You deserve to be happy. You deserve someone who will never put you in a situation like this. Goodbye, Alice. Asterisk." I read the letter over and over as if hoping the words would change, soften, or lose their weight. But they didn't. Each sentence sank deeper, leaving scars. My fingers clenched the page so tightly that it crumpled in my hands. My chest swelled with something both cold and burning. Anger, regret, pain. I couldn't tell what it was. I stepped out onto the balcony and took in the cool morning air. The sea was calm, but inside me a storm raged. Jessica. Her face came to mind, her bright smile, her words of support even when I had been distant. She had been everything I needed and everything I had destroyed. I remembered all the times she had waited for my call, asking what was wrong, and I stayed silent. Now that silence felt deafening. I pulled out my phone and stared at her number. My heart reached for that final anchor, but the question echoed in my mind. Could I ever look her in the eye after everything? Was it worth trying to rebuild what I had shattered? Or should I let go and start over, without her? Alice's letter still burned in my hand. I knew this was the last chapter of that story. What came next was a new beginning. What it would be depended entirely on me. I made the decision to go home, to return to the life I had lost and either try to make things right with Jessica or walk away for good, to free both her and myself from the weight of everything that had happened. The city greeted me with gray skies and a cold wind. Cars sped by, their reflections flickering on the wet pavement. People huddled in their coats, as if hiding from something more than the chill. I walked down the street, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on me. The corner cafe looked as warm as I remembered. Through the window, I saw Jessica. Her blonde hair fell loosely over her shoulders and her gaze was distant, as if she was searching for answers somewhere beyond the glass. For a second, I wanted to turn around and leave. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up. There was a brief flicker of joy in her eyes, but it faded as soon as I sat down across from her. "You're back," she said softly, almost to herself. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the table. The words wouldn't come. We sat facing each other like strangers, separated by everything that had happened. "What happened, Evan?" She didn't demand an answer, but I could see that she was hoping for something. An explanation, maybe. I clenched my hands, feeling the emptiness spread inside me. "We can't go back," I said quietly, so quietly I wasn't sure she heard. She stared at me for a long moment before lowering her eyes to her coffee. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup as if searching for stability. "I see," she whispered, and sat up straighter, trying to compose herself. We didn't say anything else. Words had lost their meaning. Everything had been decided before I even walked into that cafe. I watched her as she walked out the door and disappeared into the gray shadows of the street. Once outside, I headed straight for the shore. The wind whipped against the railings, cold and sharp. Waves rolled onto the sand, erasing the footprints left behind by someone else. The sound was relentless, endless, repeating the same story over and over, one that no one wanted to hear. I stopped at the edge and looked out at the horizon. The sea stretched out endlessly, like life itself, with its losses and regrets. Alice's words echoed in my mind. Some moments are better left unfinished. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The air was fresh, cold, and it felt like it was cleansing me from the inside. For a brief moment, I felt peace. Not the desire to go back or to fix things, but simply to exist. Somewhere in the distance, seagulls cried, and the waves kept rushing to the shore, telling their endless stories. And though I didn't know what lay ahead, I knew I was ready to take the next step.